So today we're gonna cover our elements of art. These are our notes. First thing that I mentioned that I would like for you to do is make sure you put your name at the top. So I'm gonna do that very quickly on mine. Okay, we're in third hour, and put whatever hour you're in. But our elements of art, those are essentially our building blocks for how to make art. They're the ingredients or blueprints, so that you guys can understand how this document flows. We have our term along the top row, we have our definition in the second row, and we have an example drawing that we're going to complete together in the third row. So looking at our elements of art, we have line, shape, color, value, form, space, texture. Again, those are the elements that we use to make our art. We use lines, we use shapes, we use color, value, form, space, and texture to build our art project, okay? So for our example drawing, it's just very simply just going to be to rewrite those. I'm going to kind of zoom in here. So just starting at the top, I'm writing down line. You can follow right along and do this with me. Shape, color, value, form, space, and texture. Okay. So in the art world, again, that's what we use to help build and make our art. Okay. Looking at our first one, you've all experienced line before. You've done it a lot in elementary school. However, now when we start talking about art, I don't want you to say, hey, those look like nice lines. Hey, I want you to be more expressive and say, wow, I really like your use of vertical lines or curvy lines or thick or thin lines, okay? So technically, a line is defined as a moving point in space. So if we think about that, if I take my pencil and I make a point and I move that point across the space, okay, I am creating a line, okay? So that would be our first example drawing. Now we're just gonna kind of take some of the examples that are listed up here on this little image, and maybe we have some ocean lines, okay? You can add whatever lines you'd like, but if you wanna follow with me, you can do that too. But maybe I wanna make a thick line, then thin. Maybe I wanna make it zigzag. And go back and add some thickness to it. Maybe just on the up lines. Okay. Maybe it's a dotted line. Okay, we also call those implied lines. Maybe we want to use it for an outline. If I want to draw just like a quick little cloud, kind of cartoon cloud here, then I can add some extra curvy lines in there to give the idea that it's a cloud. Maybe I want to do parallel lines. Those are lines that forever travel into space at the same angle and never touch. Okay. And or maybe it's like curlicue lines. Okay, that maybe we develop into a pattern, something that repeats, singular thing that repeats over and over. Okay. So again, just kind of looking at this little image up here, I covered many of them, but we for sure talking about outlines, we can create patterns, and we can also use lines to create space. Okay. Okay, on to shapes. Many of you know what shapes are. If I asked you, hey, name a shape, many of you could do that. But now we're going to break it up into two categories. Okay, we have geometric and organic shapes. So kind of looking at this image, okay, our geometric shapes are on the top. Many of you would start naming geometric shapes if I asked you. You'd say triangle, rectangle, square, circle, oval, diamond. Those represent geometric ones. Organic ones, though, okay, just as it says here in our definition, are flowing edges or inspired by nature. I also just define them as blobs. Okay, so if we have kind of a splat, or it isn't one of these rough cut basic shapes, it's likely going to be a blob or an organic shape. Okay, so I'm just going to draw a little T-graph on the bottom, and what that looks like is dividing your section in half, add a little header section, okay, and you're going to mark geometric on the left and organic on the right. Okay. And I'm just going to list a couple of them. So we have a square, a rectangle, okay, a circle, an oval, and a triangle, and I'm going to add a diamond in there. And then organic, it could be sharp edge, it could be sharp and soft, curvy edges, or it could be all curvy edges, soft edges, It could be all spiky. Okay? And then as we saw in our picture, it could also be like a flower, a teardrop, a cloud, those kinds of things. Now we are on to form. Okay, form. And just kind of looking at the two differences here, a form is three-dimensional. Okay, it has volume. Okay, so we think of these like pyramids, rectangular prisms, cubes, spheres, cylinder, and cone. And so looking from a shape to a form to help students understand this, okay, your shape is like the flat, okay, triangle. And then all of a sudden, if you could build that into a 3D object, it would become a form, which is a triangular pyramid. Okay, so a rectangle would become a rectangular prism, a square would become a cube, circle into a sphere. Your cylinder is actually circles and rectangles combined. Okay, and then your cone could be an oval or circle and a triangle wrapped around it. Okay, so that's how we can change our shapes into forms. Another way that I teach my students how to learn it is you can actually hold a physical form, right? So this spray bottle up at the front of my room, this would technically be a physical form, right? If I were to just draw the outline of it though, that would then maybe turn it into an organic shape, okay? So just on the bottom here for our example drawing, this is where we're gonna divide it again kind of into that T-graph, and we're gonna do shapes versus forms and that equation of how they change. So I'm gonna put shapes and then versus, which is VS, forms. So the first example would be the square into the cube. So I'm gonna draw my square. And then for the cube, I like to start by drawing the front panel as a square. Then we take 3 corners and we draw diagonal lines going back at the same angle. So they go back at the same angle from 3 of those corners. Blow it up here so you guys can see it. And then from there, I'm taking this vertical line that's on the front panel and copying it to the back, so it's another vertical line. I'm taking this front horizontal panel and I'm just going to copy and paste that horizontal line on the back side. And that's how you build a cube. Okay. The next one, we're going to talk about a circle into a sphere. So when you try and do this, we're going to have to do some shading and adding a value. So in order to make this circle into a sphere, I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to create, just kind of pressing hard, a little bit of a crescent moon shape. So it's a little arc. Okay, that's the dark core shadow. Then on this white space down here, I'm just going to lightly fill it in so it gets a little lighter down there. And then I'm going to just add some lighter values, kind of going in an oval circle, but leaving a little white space right here where the sun is going to be shining directly on it. Okay, so now we can make it look a little more 3D. And the last one we're going to talk about is the triangle into the triangular pyramid. So one way that I like to draw this is to start by making a tent. Okay, and then down in the middle, you're going to make a longer line, just barely longer. And then you're just going to draw 2 diagonal lines connecting the middle lines to the outer lines. Okay, creates kind of that triangular prism. Okay, so again, forms are 3-dimensional. You can hold them in your hand, right? On to the back side. Okay, looking at value. So value is the lightness or darkness. We talked about it a little bit with our forms. So we can use value to create form. We can use value with color. So if you would like to change a color or add some dark or lightness to your colors, you can add black, white, gray, or brown. If you want to add brown in there, those are our neutral colors. And they specifically talk about if you add black to a color, that creates a term that we'll need to know later is a shade. Okay? If you add white to a color, it makes it lighter, and that's called a tint. Okay? If you add gray to a color, that creates what's called a tone. Okay? Those are vocabulary terms that we'll cover later when we talk about color, but we can introduce them right now. Okay, but again, definition-wise, lightness or darkness, white is the lightest. Middle gray, that's a technical term, is the halfway point. Okay, and then black is the darkest. So we're just going to break it down into 3 separate value scales to show you how you can do it. So I'm going to divide my sections into thirds. So draw 2 lines. And for the first value scale, if you're left-handed, you want to do the opposite of what I'm doing so you don't smear your hand through what I'm drawing. But we're going to just start on the left because I'm right-handed. And I'm going to press hard and I'm going to work towards the right. And as I go to the right, I'm going to start easing up my pencil pressure, lighter and lighter and lighter until it disappears into white. That's a very basic value scale. Again, if you're left-handed, you want to do the opposite. You want to start dark over on the right and work to the left. Okay, that way you don't smear your hand through your pencil. Okay. The next way that we can create value is doing what's called stippling. Okay, stippling basically is a fancy word for making a bunch of dots. Okay, so if we make our dots kind of larger and closer together on the back side here, okay, kind of going kind of quick here, and they touch or they overlap, and then as you work your way out, okay, if they suddenly start to get smaller and more spread out, that also creates value. So I'm going to go back in and kind of add in some more here. So we want to make it look dark. Okay, they're larger on this side, they're medium sized, and then they start to spread out. It creates value. This again is called stippling when you add dots. Okay, looks darker over here, looks lighter on the right. The last one that I'm going to teach you is called hatching and cross hatching. Again, these are just fancy terms that we use in art to talk about drawing lines. So hatching would be taking and drawing lines that go generally in the same direction. Okay, if I start making them kind of thick and then I thin them out, that can create that idea. So I'm doing what's called hatching. I'm adding in more shorter ones on this side and then longer thin ones, okay, to go through the space. Looks darker over here, lighter over here. It's called hatching. And then cross hatching is essentially crossing over our lines and hatching. Okay, so I'm just going to pick any other direction, but I'm going to do vertical up and down. And if I start adding more lines towards the dark side, okay, that's going to make it look darker. And then I can add just a couple lines on the lighter side. This is called cross hatching. I'm just crossing over my hatching. So those are a couple different ways that we can add value to something. Generally, you'd probably see hatching with hair, okay, or making grass. Okay, cross hatching you might see more so with like creating netting or texture on a building, okay, or weaving. Yep. All right, we're into space. Space is kind of a big term. There's a lot of different ways that you can create space. One of the main ones is that space has positive and negative areas. So when we're looking at this image up here, the negative space is the black here. It's everything around that flower. Okay? The positive space would then be the flower. Okay? So it's just identifying your object. That would be the positive space. Everything around that object would be the negative space. Okay? Space can also be talked about as like background, middle ground, and foreground. That's something that you learned in elementary school. So our background generally is at the top of the paper. It's the farthest away from us. Our middle ground is kind of in the middle of the paper. It's kind of between the background and foreground, things that are closest to us. And our foreground, again, those are generally the largest, okay, and they're the closest to us. They're generally at the bottom of the paper, okay? Other ways that you can create the illusion of space is overlapping using perspective. So thinking about smaller and blurrier objects are in the distance. So the farther I put my hand away from my face, the smaller it looks and the blurrier it looks. The closer I put it to my face, depending on if you're far-sighted or nearsighted, the larger it is and the clearer I can see it, right? So with that, when we go to draw our couple different examples, we're going to make a few. Okay, the first one is I'm just going to draw a rectangle and add a circle inside of it. Okay, we're going to call that circle the positive space. This is what I want my viewers to look at. Okay. I'm writing positive space. The background, or if we call this like a sheet of paper, this is going to be my negative space. Okay. We talked about overlapping can create a sense of depth. So if I start doing like a bunch of like little bubbles that kind of overlap each other, some medium, some small, if I make a really large one back here, okay, and then maybe even if I had a tiny one over here, that gives us like a sense of depth. Okay? There's space between those circles. Okay. And then the last one would be like perspective. We're just going to briefly touch on this, but again, we're going to go over this as a whole unit of perspective. But when you start drawing in 1 point perspective, you have a horizon line and what's called a vanishing point. Okay. From there, we're going to just draw a square. Okay. And the idea is to connect this square back to the vanishing point. I'm going to draw lines that look like they fade back in towards that vanishing point. So something like this. I'll kind of zoom in here so you guys can maybe see a little bit better. Okay, so those, what are called receding lines, go back towards that vanishing point. And then I'm just going to close out my box, take this vertical line, copy and paste it on the back side. I take this horizontal line and copy and paste it on the back side, and that makes my cube. Okay. And then if I wanted to make it look really, really small, okay, I could maybe add another cube back over here, but I might only see kind of that front panel. So if I make a smaller cube, okay, I might barely be able to see some of those details, just adding a couple of those little lines in there. So I'm just making it smaller, and then I have a larger one. It looks like it's going farther back into space. Okay, we're on to color. Okay, and color is another really big term. We're going to cover color as a whole unit coming up here. So with that, color is essentially light reflecting off a surface. So that means the reason why I can see the different colors that you guys are wearing today, for example, a red sweatshirt, is because with light, all of the other light waves are being absorbed into that sweatshirt, and then just the red is bouncing off of it into the rods and cones that are in the back of my eye. Okay? If it's black, everything is being absorbed, or all of the light particle is being absorbed, so we're not getting any light coming back into our eyes. Okay? That's why when you turn the lights off, you're like, you can't see. It's because nothing is reflecting off of anything. Okay? If it's white, then we're seeing every single light wavelength coming back at us. Okay? So it's kind of fun to talk about color. The difference between seeing it and mixing it, they're two different things. Okay? So when we talk about color, though, we can break it down into three main components. Okay? Our three main components are hue, which is essentially a fancy word for saying the name of a color. So I could say, hey, you're wearing a very nice hue today. I'm basically saying, hey, you're wearing a really nice color today. Or instead of saying red, I could say, wow, that's a really nice hue. Okay, that's a really nice red. They're just saying the same thing. Okay, for value, we've already talked about that. That's just how light or dark the hue is, okay, or the color is. And then the intensity is the quality of brightness. So we think about like neon versus like more of a muted tone or neutral color. Okay, so when it comes to color schemes, that's just talking about groupings of colors. I've already taught you guys a little bit about warm and cool colors. Those are technically color schemes. It's just how we group colors together to identify what looks good, maybe what doesn't look good, or what creates contrast, right? We're going to talk about complementary colors eventually, and again, this just touches on, again, the tint makes white, tone is adding gray, and adding black creates a shade. Okay? So down here, I'm just going to give you the little nifty guide from elementary school. Some of you learned this, some of you did not. But his name is Mr. Roy G. Biv. Okay? And in elementary school, you learned B-I-V. I'm going to take the I out because it just makes it confusing with all the different ways that you can use this tool. Okay? So here's, if you remember Roy G. Biv, here's how you can use it. His first name is the warm colors. His middle initial and last name are the cool colors. Okay. And then here's what's kind of fun. We talk about primaries and secondary colors. You guys have probably heard that term in elementary school. Okay. primary, another term for primary is first. Okay, so the first letter is a primary color, so I'm going to write a number 1 next to that. Okay, if you skip a letter and go to the third one, that's also a primary color, is yellow. Okay, if you skip another letter and go to blue, that also is the primary color. So primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. You just skip the letters. Secondary colors are orange, green, and violet. Okay? And how you make a secondary color is you mix the two primaries that wrap around it. So red and yellow make orange, yellow and blue make green. If I started this again, okay, blue and red make violet. Okay, so this is how you can really use this tool to help you figure out some color mixing. Okay? All right, our last one is texture. So let's talk about it. Texture is the way things feel or look if touched. So there's physical texture. If I could touch like a brick wall and that's part of an artwork, okay, architecture, that would represent just rough texture, right? Okay, or physical texture. If I draw a brick building and you can't actually feel the roughness, but it looks rough, that would be what we would call implied texture, okay? So down here on our examples, I'm just gonna break it up into 4 quadrants. And the first texture that I'm gonna make is gonna be like Swiss cheese. So I'm gonna just create a bunch of circles that kind of overlap each other. Kind of go off the page a little bit. Reminds me of Swiss cheese. Another one that we could do is netting. So if I just do some hatching of straight lines and then do some cross hatching, going over the top of them in a different direction, okay, that can create the texture of netting. I'm going to teach you guys the texture of brick. So I like to just start with horizontal lines. So 2 horizontal lines. Then you can decide vertical lines on the first row and the same vertical lines in the same spot on the third row. And then in the second row, you're going to go between those 2 lines to make brick texture. Okay, so I'll kind of go through that again. For the first row, you're drawing 2 lines. Then you're repeating those same 2 lines on the third row. And then for your second row, just go between them. Okay. Our last one that we're going to do kind of reminds me of like toolbox or running boards on truck kind of texture. So I think about it just starting these kind of upside down V's or tent lines. And then going back the other opposite way. So this is kind of a broken V. And then doing it throughout the whole square, I'm just going to repeat what I did. Okay, start by making the little tents. And then making my broken V's. And then I can even go off the paper too. So filling in the top part. Okay, it kind of creates this rough, bumpy texture. All right, that completes just our example drawings and our notes for our elements of art. Do you guys have any questions or repeats that need to be taken care of?